Hey guys, today we are talking about the second agricultural revolution. Don't worry, we will briefly touch on the first agricultural revolution. And if we take a look here first at the objective from College Board, you need to be able to explain the advances and impacts of the second agricultural revolution. So all this was prompted by new technology, by increased food production, and overall led to better diets, longer life expectancies, and more people available to work in factories since they weren't having to farm so much. So before we get to the second agricultural revolution, let's touch briefly on the first agricultural revolution. This happened during the Neolithic era, which was more or less 12 to 10,000 years ago. And just like we learned in one of our previous videos, in the Fertile Crescent, which was like the first civilization and the first place where agriculture was invented. Diffusion happened through trade routes and the Columbian Exchange. So characteristics of the first agricultural revolution include being the origin of farming. So this was the first domestication of plants and animals. So instead of having to be nomadic groups or groups of hunters and gatherers, people were then able to settle because they were able to grow their own food and raise their own animals. So this first started off with subsistence farming, which we have mentioned before. So it's this idea that farmers grow crops for themselves and their families. It's not to sell. There might be instances where they might trade with some of their neighbors, but ultimately subsistence farming is food for themselves to subsist. The methods that were used during the first agricultural revolution were pretty simple, things like hand tools, and it used a lot of manual labor, physical labor. Then we come into the second agricultural revolution, and this is where everything changes. So it began more or less in about 1750 in Great Britain and eventually diffused into the rest of Europe and the US. So for the causes of the second agricultural revolution, this is directly tied to the Industrial Revolution. So using technology or mechanization to increase production and distribution of agricultural goods. So here we have a few examples of this kind of technology and mechanization. So the cotton gin, which we see right here, was used to this was technology, right? This was like a little machine that was used to pick the seeds out of cotton. So that went from being a manual labor, right, from people actually doing that with their hands to just using this machine here. Also, other things like the seed drill, the steel plow, and barbed wire, so like super innovative. All of these things, I know maybe for us, especially when we look at this, right, we think like, oh my gosh, that is that is not technology, but it really was, because prior to these things, people had to do this completely by hand. So what we saw as a result was much higher yields, which then led to a surplus of food. So boom, they have a lot of food left over, which means population growth and longer life expectancy, because food became much more certain, right, at that point. We also see more technology, which meant less manual labor. And that meant that we didn't need as many farmers. So that then freed people up to move to urban areas and work in factories and change their lifestyle completely. So we continue to see the development of agriculture today, right? But make sure that you link second agricultural revolution directly to the industrial revolution. We also see in the second agricultural revolution this idea of the enclosure movement. So this is more specific to Britain. These are laws that were enacted by the British government that allowed people to purchase land and then enclose this land. So that was a big change for them. As mentioned earlier, this happened in like the mid to late 1700s. And before that, land was more communal. Peasant farmers could use that land as well. But because people were then able to purchase and then put up fences, like actual physical barriers, we see a few different results, including commercial agriculture, also fewer and larger farms. So because people can buy these areas up, people were then buying large plots of land or multiple plots of land and then would combine them. This in turn decreased the number of farm owners. And also, we did see an increase in farming techniques. So people felt more invested, right? Like they were literally invested. They bought this land. So we see farming techniques improve and a decrease in agricultural laborers as well. And as mentioned in the previous slide, urbanization. So mass migration of people moved into cities to work in these new factories. Also, characteristics of the second agricultural revolution include something called crop rotation. So I believe this was mentioned in the first slides, presentation 5.1. But this is planting the same crop each year. What that does to the soil is it starts to reduce the yield. It starts to use up a lot of the fertile elements of that soil. So in order to avoid that, crop rotation was then used, and basically farmers began to rotating the crops that they planted in order to protect that soil's fertility. So if we look at this here, we see this kind of rotation for a typical garden in order to keep the crop yield high and fertilization a little bit higher as well than if they didn't rotate that crop. Also, we see transportation improvements and new markets. So trains and steamboats and transportation technologies, right? These allowed farmers to ship their products further distances and at a lower cost. Prior to this technology, they'd have to take it by cart, right, or by horse, and that would be far more expensive to do. So again, keep in mind, new technology and increased food production of the second agricultural revolution led to better diets, longer life, and more people available to work in factories, which meant